Ngayon ay ang third na meeting ng RCXRF Book Club, which is about sa book ni William Lane Craig ng title ay On Guard. So ngayon we'll talk about yung third chapter ng title ay Why Does Anything at All Exist? Ang format ng book club discussions is that as their host, ako yung mag-lead ng flow ng discussion and nag-discuss ako and mention ng certain points na dinidiscuss ni Dr. Craig sa chapter. And then I ask the participants about specific questions na nasa book na open for discussion. Dahil this is merely a recap video, I will not include here ang kanilang answers, but just give my personal answers sa mga questions na yun when it was asked. Basically, ang overview ng pag-uusapan natin ay yung introduction, ang first and second premise ng argument, and lastly, ang conclusion. So let's start na sa ating discussion about sa third chapter ng book. Sa start ng chapter, Dr. Craig talks about his childhood sa Missouri, Keokuk. I've not been there and perhaps we could think of a place that is similar sa buhay natin. Marami raw kasing animals doon na pwede nila mahuli, such as ang frogs, toads, snakes, salamanders, rabbits, birds, stray dogs, at mga cats. Meron din daw mga bats and possums. And aside from this, ay kita raw nila ang stars clearly paggabi, which made him think kung saan ba galing lahat ng mga ito. Ang question raw niya na ito ay na-discover niya later on na preoccupied din daw pala yung mga philosophers sa question na yun. Ang example ng philosopher na he named ay si Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Kilala siya bilang co-discover ng calculus at kilala siya bilang isang towering intellect noong 18th century sa Europe. And ang question niya exactly is, why is there something rather than nothing? Or bakit may mga bagay na nag-exist imbis na walang nag-exist? Ang answer dito ayon kay Dr. Craig is si God. And si God ang reason kung bakit lahat ng ibang mga bagay ay nag-exist. To appreciate this even further, let us start with sharing yung syllogism ng argument ni Leibniz. Premise 1. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. Premise 3. The universe exists. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. Therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Now, before we start sa specific discussions sa premise 1 and 2, let's answer muna ang question, which of the three premises have you heard atheists challenge? On what basis did they do so? Answer. Ang narinig ko na always china-challenge ng atheists ay ang premise 2. In the same way na they ask kung sino bang nag-create kay God, they ask kung ano bang explanation kay God. This is their way of exposing ang double standards ng ibang mga theists dahil ang standard na ina-apply nila sa universe does not apply kay God. This will suffice for now, pero mamaya ay magiging clear kung paano ba dapat natin sagutin yung mga ganito na objections sa argument ni Leibniz. Going back, ang ina-affirm ng premise 1 is that lahat ng nag-exist ay may explanation sa kanilang existence, and this seems to be vulnerable sa objection ng atheists. Kasi if lahat ng nag-exist ay may explanation sa kanilang existence, then since si God ay nag-exist, then siya ay may explanation din sa kanyang existence. And ang explanation na ito could be said to be a being na greater and higher than God. Pero ito ay impossible. So ang premise 1 must be false. In light of this, ano ba sa tingin niyo ang magiging problem if ang isang Christian will say as a response sa objection na ito na si God ay nag-exist inexplicably, or is that walang explanation sa existence ni God? If ang believer will say na God exists inexplicably, ang atheist will just respond, why not stop with the universe? The universe just exists inexplicably. And dahil dito, we seem to have reached a stalemate. Now that we are able to discuss ang objection, let us now discuss or talk about our answer to the objection, which is that some things exist necessarily. Sa view kasi ni Leibniz ay may dalawang bagay na nag-exist, which are ang mga bagay na nag-exist necessarily and ang mga bagay na nag-exist contingently. Now let's discuss how do we differentiate between things that exist necessarily and contingently. Ano ang ilang examples ng mga bagay na ito? Answer. Maraming mathematicians think na ang numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities ay nag-exist necessarily. Sila raw ay hindi caused by something else, but they just exist by the necessity of their own nature. By contrast, ang mga bagay na caused to exist ng iba ay hindi nag-exist necessarily. Sila ay nag-exist dahil may iba na gumawa sa kanila. Ang ilang examples ng physical objects na nag-exist contingently ay ang mga tao, mga planeta, at mga galaxies. Based sa napag-usapan natin, it's clear na kapag sinabi ni Leibniz na everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, then ang sagot sa explanation could either be found sa necessity of yung nature ng isang bagay mismo or sa isang external na cause. This shows na ang premise 1 could be fully stated as everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. This destroys the first objection kasi ang explanation for God's existence ay ang necessity ng kanyang nature. So dito ay makita natin siya as an argument for God as a necessary and uncaused being. And instead of undermining the argument, if an atheist will object sa premise 1, I further clarify what we mean about who God is. Now, before we proceed sa next part ng ating discussion, let us answer this question. If God exists at all, why is it impossible for him to have a cause? Answer. Ang simple answer dito is that if si God ay may cause, then we can say na ang nag-create talaga sa kanya ang tunay na God. That's why when atheists ask us the question, who created God, we know na mali ang assumption ng kanilang question. Kasi we are not talking about the gods of Greek mythology na obviously created by other gods. We're talking about the God of the Bible na by definition ay necessarily existent. He cannot not exist. Nag-exist siya by the necessity of his own nature. Hindi siya nag-depend on something else para mag-exist. Now, ano ba ang reason natin for thinking na totoo na lahat ng mga bagay ay may explanation for their existence? Minsan, ang mga atheists will say na ang premise 1 ay true para sa lahat ng asa loob ng universe, pero hindi siya true of the universe mismo. Lahat daw ng asa universe ay may explanation. Pero ang universe in itself ay walang explanation. How should we respond to this objection? Answer? Ang response na ito ay nag-commit ng taxi cab fallacy. Ayon sa 19th century philosopher na si Arthur Schopenhauer, na ang first premise raw cannot be dismissed like a hack once you've arrived sa desired destination mo. Hindi mo pwede sabihin na lahat ng mga bagay ay may explanation sa existence nila. Then suddenly you will exempt the universe. It would be arbitrary for the atheist to claim na ang universe ay exception sa rule na ito. Take note ng premise 1 does not make exceptions for God. Ang illustration natin ng translucent ball sa woods showed na ang mere na pag-increase ng size ng isang bagay does not remove ang isang bagay for the need for an explanation. Another problem sa objection na ito ay isa siyang unscientific na response dahil ang modern na cosmology or ang study ng universe ay nag-devote ng search sa explanation ng existence ng universe. So ang attitude ng atheist ay crippling sa science if it is practiced scientifically. Now, may mga atheists naman na mag-justify ng universe ay exception sa first premise. Sasabihin nila na impossible for the universe to have an explanation kasi ang universe would need to have a prior state of affairs kung saan ay ang universe ay hindi pa nag-exist. And that would be nothingness. Nothingness cannot be an explanation of anything. Dahil dito ay ang universe raw ay dapat mag-exist lang inexplicably. How should we answer this objection? Answer. Fallacious ang reasoning kasi ang assumption nito is that everything na nag-exist lamang ay ang universe, and if walang universe, then wala na nag-exist. This shows ng assumption ng objection ay ang atheism ay true, which is ang fallacy of begging the question. Si Leibniz ay mag-agree ng explanation ng universe must be a prior state of affairs kung saan ang universe ay hindi nag-exist. Pero ang state of affairs na yun ay si God and ang will niya and hindi nothingness. For this reason ay makita natin na ang premise 1 ay plausibly true than false. Ito ang kailangan natin for a good argument. Before we proceed sa discussion sa second premise, let's try to discuss ang isang question ni Dr. Craig sa On Guard. Ang sabi niya, quote, "It's hard to imagine nothing. We can imagine empty space, but empty space is something, not nothing. Try to imagine that only God exists, not the universe, not empty space, not even time. What goes on in your head when you try to conceive of this? Now suppose that not even God exists. End quote. Answer. Nahirapan ako to do this exercise. I'm thinking maybe dahil isa akong matter na situated din sa time, space, and matter. If you imagine kasi non-being, wala ring time, space, and matter doon. Struggle rin ako to imagine na only God exists. Though conceivable siya in my mind, nahirapan lang ako kasi may possibility na ang image na makreate ko of God is something na mag-diminish ng kanyang glory. Nevertheless, logically conceivable siya compared sa wala talagang kahit ano na nag-exist. Then bigla na lang magkaroon ng universe. Premise 2. Now, naandito na tayo sa premise 2, which is if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God, then let us explain kung ano bang logical equivalence ng na-mention sa chapter. Kailangan i-discuss natin ito para maging clear bakit atheists unwittingly agree with premise 2. Ang logical equivalence is that ang dalawang statements ay logically equivalent if impossible for one to be true at ang isa ay false. They are either both true or both false. Isa sa pinaka-important na logical equivalence ay ang contraposition. Sinasabi nito na ang any statement ng form na if P then Q ay logically equivalent sa if not Q then not P. Important na ma-discuss ito kasi ang premise to ay awkward sa atheist dahil logically equivalent ito sa typical response ng isang atheist sa argument ni Leibniz. Ang dalawang statements ay logically equivalent kung impossible for one to be true and the other one false. They stand or fall together. So ano bang sinasabi lagi ng atheist in response sa argument ni Leibniz? As we have seen, ang sinasabi nila ay lagi ang A, which is if atheism is true, the universe has no explanation of its existence. Ito ang response sa premise 1 kung saan ay sinasabi nila na ang universe ay nag-exist inexplicably. Pero ito ay logically equivalent sa B, which is if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then atheism is not true. Dahil logically equivalent sila, then hindi mo pwede i-affirm ang A then deny B. Pero ang B ay synonymous sa premise 2. So if we say in response sa premise 1 na given atheism na wala itong explanation, then ang atheist ay implicitly nag-admit ng premise 2, which is that if ang universe ay may explanation, then si God ay nag-exist. Let us now proceed to talk about the cause ng universe. Ito ba ay cause ng isang abstract object or ng isang unembodied mind? Now, before we discuss this, ano ba yung difference ng abstract and concrete objects? Ang philosophers ay nag-distinguish ng objects as either being abstract or concrete. Ang defining the difference between them is that ang abstract objects ay causally effete or impotent. Ibig sabihin ay wala silang power to do anything sa real world. Ang concrete objects naman can cause effects in the world. Ang mga objects na ina-identify ng philosophers sa abstract ay ang mathematical entities tulad ng numbers, sets, functions, and kasama rin ng propositions, properties, fictional characters, at musical and literary works. Now, going back sa premise 2, we can say na plausible ang premise by its own right. Ito ay dahil when we talk about the universe, we are talking about all space-time reality, which includes all matter and energy. So if ang universe ay may explanation sa kanyang existence, then ang cause nito ay dapat hindi physical, hindi material, at dapat ay beyond siya sa space and time. Now, meron lamang dalawang possible na nag-fit sa description na ito. It could either be an abstract object or an unembodied mind. Kaso ang abstract object ay causally effete. Ibig sabihin na hindi nito kaya mag-cause ng kahit ano. Ang kahit anong number na maisip natin ay hindi kaya mag-cause ng kahit anong effects in itself. Dahil dito ay ang cause ng universe ay dapat isang transcendent na unembodied mind which we understand to be God. Let's proceed sa possible objection ng isang atheist. Now, ano ba ang pwede gawin ng isang atheist? Ang isang radical na option na open sa kanya ay to not object sa premise 1. Tapos ang sasabihin na lang niya is that ang universe ay may explanation for its existence. Ang sasabihin naman niya ngayon ay ang universe ay nag-exist according sa necessity of its own nature. So para sa isang atheist, ang universe ay magiging God's substitute as something na nag-exist necessarily. Going back, kaya radical ang idea na ito ay dahil walang part ng universe ang nag-exist necessarily. If we think about it, it seems na ang bawat part nito ay nag-come into being and then it failed to exist. Pero pwede sabihin ng isang skeptic is that baka ang matter kung saan composed ang isang bagay ay yun yung nag-exist necessarily and not the object itself. Pero ang problem dito ayon sa standard model ng subatomic physics ay ang matter mismo ay composed ng tiny fundamental particles na hindi ma-breakdown further. Now, this begs the question, hindi ba pwede na magkaroon tayo ng ibang collection ng fundamental particles instead of the ones we have? Ang bawat fundamental particle ba ay nag-exist necessarily? Dito, ang sabi ni Dr. Craig is that an atheist cannot say ng elementary particles ay merely configurations of matter that could have been different. Pero ang matter of which kung saan gawang particles ay nag-exist necessarily. Ito ay dahil ang elementary particles are not composed of anything dahil sila ay basic units of matter. So if ang isang particle ay hindi nag-exist, then ang matter ay hindi nag-exist. In addition, sabi ni Dr. Craig na obvious na a different collection of fundamental particles could have existed instead of the collection that we have. But if that were the case, then ibang universe ang mag-exist. Dito ay nag-give siya ng illustration of a desk made of ice. Imagine your own desk na made of wood or plastic and ngayon ay made na siya of ice. And sa illustration, it's obvious na hindi na siya same na desk with the one you have. In the same way, if ang universe ay made up of different particles, kahit identically arranged siya with the one that we have, then it's still a different universe. Thus, it follows na ang universe ay hindi nag-exist by the necessity of its own nature. Based dito, sa napag-usapan natin ay it's clear na ang claim na ang universe ay hindi necessarily nag-exist ay mas obvious when we think na it's possible for us to have a different set of fundamental particles from the ones we have. And kahit we assume na ang laws of nature natin ay logically necessary, ay possible pa rin na maging ibang laws of nature natin dahil ang mga substances na mag-exist ay may properties na iba sa fundamental particles natin. Based dito, ay we can say na we have a different universe. And if ang atheist would deny premise 2 and say na ang universe ay nag-exist necessarily, then like premise 1 ay we can say na ang premise 2 ay plausibly true. Conclusion. Given ang truth ng tatlong premises, ang conclusion ay inescapable. Si God ang explanation sa existence ng universe. Moreover, ang argument ay nag-imply na si God ay isang uncaused, unembodied mind na nag-transcend sa physical universe and sa space and time. With this in mind, we leave with a question that we can think about on our own. How has this chapter shown that God is an unembodied mind, transcends the universe, created the universe?